I would like to take a few minutes from your rich and wonderful life to share with you what I think is one of the most amazing moments in American literature, and it comes in chapter 10 of Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Chapter 10 has a lot going on in it. There's a wonderful description of Mr. Covey, the lower class, the poor white slave breaker, and his role and status, and the way he himself is a product of the horrors of slavery. There's the devastating story of Caroline the Breeder, who's literally tied together with Samuel Harrison by Covey and his wife to create wealth and property for them in the form of human children. And then a wonderful melancholy apostrophe to the ships on Chesapeake Bay as the dispirited slave Frederick Douglass looks on at what he sees as symbols of both freedom and the denial of his freedom. Really all powerful and amazingly written stuff. But the moment I want to look at is the moment where Douglass declares, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." This reversal, this Xing of language, is often referred to as chiasmus. And chiasmus is just a classic Latin term in rhetoric for the crisscrossing in a language structure. Now, specifically speaking, because this reversal uses the exact same words without changing the grammatical role of the words. In other words, verbs don't become subjects, subjects don't become verbs, etc. It's just a literal reversing of the words. This is probably best literally described as anti-metabole. But the thing is, in contemporary culture, chiasmus is a much more interesting word because it's more broadly used by critics and thinkers. And so I think it is the best word to use to describe this in our contemporary culture, although it's not as specifically correct. Chiasmus is a really interesting idea to think about because this crisscrossing doesn't always have to be literal when we accept chiasmus more as sort of a symbolic structure as well. So I think we can see in this moment where Douglass confronts and overcomes Covey, we can see in this moment a metaphoric chiasmus as well, right? Where the slave breaker is broken and the broken slave is made whole. So chiasmus is a cool literary device term to be able to play with because it's a literal rhetorical move, but it's also a metaphoric, symbolic, in times metonymic structure. So what's so interesting about this moment, and we're right around page 1048 in the text now. I believe the previous line that I quoted comes a few pages earlier than that. Let me get you the page reference. I should have put it on the PowerPoint. It's on 1045 that we see that example of chiasmus that I discussed. But the real nuts and bolts of the battle are on 1048. And here's a few lines from it that are interesting. This moment where Douglass literally grabs Covey by the throat is so radical. You're thinking about 1845. This is the great anxiety of the white South, right? That the black people of the South will grab the throats of their slave masters. So this is the story of one man, but it's a metaphor for the potential power of a people. And I love here the phrase "I rose," because it's working on both a physical level and a symbolic level, right? Douglass is rising up literally with his hand around Covey's throat, but he's also rising up metaphorically as a human being. Because at this point in the book, Douglass describes himself as broken and dispirited. And it is this moment of resistance that really brings him back to himself. But his rising, of course, is a symbolic uprising of slaves, and the willingness of Douglass to resort to physical force, both here early in his life and later manifested in his advocacy for the Civil War, which he felt was the only way slavery was going to be changed. Douglass is different than both the abolitionists who support him as a speaker and as a person in his early career, and from other African American leaders in the North. It was rare and considered dangerous to call for this kind of physical resistance. And then, again, I want to point out that lovely simile in this same passage on page 1048, where Covey is described as trembling like a leaf. And the complete reversal here of power is so dramatic. It's a chiasmus, right? It's a metaphoric chiasmus. The powerful have been reduced to weakness, and the weak have risen up and become powerful. Douglass himself describes this as a turning point, and he uses a metaphor of fire here, which is a metaphor for spirit. And at this point, his language has a real classical rhetorical ring to it. The embers represent his spirit. The rekindling is the way that his spirit is lifted up in this moment of confrontation. But the spirit is not really divine in the direct sense. It's freedom here. And in that way, this is the language at this point of democratic idealism rather than the language of religious idealism or Christian idealism. And it's the rhetoric of the classical tradition rather than the rhetoric of the biblical tradition. I point that out because in less than a page, in a paragraph away, we're going to see the opposite. Douglass was a master of both realms. And then my own manhood is an important phrase for us. This is where it's important to remember that Douglass's novel works on many levels, or not his novel, his autobiography works on many levels. It is a slave narrative and designed specifically to denounce slavery, but it's also a coming-of-age story for a man in 19th century America. And this language of manhood is important to the Douglass narrative and a striking difference from, say, the narrative of Harriet Jacobs in Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl. And finally, that phrase, gratification afforded by my triumph. To me, this is a classic example of the beauty and sophistication of Douglass's language. Afforded by my triumph. That verb afforded is a verb that is the language of American speech making. It has a classical elevation about it, and you can imagine Douglass thundering from a podium in front of a large crowd. Remember, thundering without sound systems in the early 1840s, right, when Douglass was speaking, and speaking as a sort of sponsored by the abolitionist movement. Okay, so that is, again, the sort of high point of the democratic idealism of this moment. But here we switch to a different register. It's the register of Christian idealism and the deployment of illusion and metaphor that are illusions and metaphors that are biblical in their resonance. So the bloody arm of slavery. This is definitely sort of the biblical language of outrage. And of course, it's fascinating, right? Because it is a classic example of personification, right? Slavery is created as a persona that acts, that has agency, and then embedded in that personification is a metonym, right? The body of slavery, the bloody arm of slavery, is a representation for slavery as a whole. So it's really kind of sophisticated use of personification and metonymy in the same phrasing, and then you get where it is the resurrection, and so this is clearly a direct allusion to a Christ-like experience, right? Resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. What's great here about Douglass is he not only constructs the metaphor, but he interprets it for us, right? So, resurrection from the tomb to heaven, he tells us the tomb is slavery, the heaven is freedom. So he interprets for us the vehicle and tenor, right? That's unusual too. And that's a classic Douglass move, right? Where he invokes the language but also interprets it. He's going to leave us no room for error. Then that lovely phrase at the end, right? That antithesis, slave in form, slave in fact. So that really is that powerful language at the end, that he was no longer a slave in the more meaningful sense of on the spiritual level. It's just a lovely moment in our culture and literature, and it resonates in such amazing ways here in the 21st century as we come to the end of an Obama presidency, as we confront the challenges that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to our consciousness by calling us to account for a long history of brutality against our fellow humans and countrymen. And Douglas is one of the first great voices, but as we know from this course, not a voice that comes out of nowhere. When we think about how powerful and resonant Douglas's voice is and how he is without question one of our greatest writers, we hear before him other voices, right? Equiano, Absalom Jones, and other voices of African American resistance. But Douglas, informed by Emerson, informed by abolitionism, informed by classical and biblical literature, brings the rhetoric to a new height and gives it an enduring power that will be a jumping off point for Black writers that are to follow him. Not the least of which we could think of people like James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who are nonfiction writers who follow in his tradition. Okay, I think that's it for now. I think I've spent a lot of your time here, but I hope it was worthwhile. This is an amazing moment in our cultural history. Thanks. Bye.